Hi folks, and welcome back. We're going to talk now a little bit about the Gospel of Luke, at least the introductory material, before we look at the Passion narrative. In accord with the two-source theory, the major sources of Luke's Gospel would be the Gospel of Mark. So the majority view holds to Mark in priority, and that Luke does significant editing of Mark, or the material from Mark, including omitting some material, rearranging other material. We have what's called the lesser and greater interpolations, large bodies of material that are inserted into the text from the Gospel of Mark. We also see the use of Q. Remember, Q may or may not be one source, maybe many sources. It's usually seen as relatively early material, and in the case of Luke, many scholars suggest that his use of it is a little more raw than Matthew, which is usually said to have done more editing, although that's also not provable. That would be somewhat speculative. We also, though, have material that would be unique to Luke's Gospel, usually designated as L material. This material may come from one or more sources, and it's important to us because it reveals Luke's special interests. And of course, it includes some of the more memorable passages found in the Gospel, like the parables of the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, or Lazarus and the rich man. We also have unique material in Luke's infancy and resurrection accounts. So remember, Matthew also added infancy and resurrection accounts, but they are different. They're very significant, differ significantly from Luke. The Gospel itself does not identify its author, although the text does acknowledge that its author is in fact not a witness, that he consults with witnesses. This is found right in the first 3 verses. Irenaeus, who lived in the late 2nd century A.D., identified Luke as the inseparable companion of Paul. And hence that associating this figure Luke with the Luke who is mentioned there, who apparently is a physician. The Muratorian companion also identifies Luke as physician and companion to Paul. The question is that tradition to be believed or not? Is it beyond question? Certainly one piece of evidence in its favor would be the fact that in the Acts of the Apostles, the 2nd volume of Luke, we have the so-called we passages, where the text speaks in the 2nd person plural, suggesting that the author is a companion to Paul. We also notice in Acts that Paul is really the hero of the story, so there's great emphasis placed on Paul, again suggesting someone associated with his tradition. And then there are some links to be found in the terminology between Paul's writings and his letters and the Paul who speaks in various speeches in the Acts of the Apostles. On the other hand, there are major differences in language and style between the letters and Acts. There are also some disagreements about the details of Paul's life, and Acts seems to be unaware of Paul's practice of using letters, suggesting that perhaps the Luke who is the author of the Gospel is not in fact the Luke mentioned in the letters, physician and companion to Paul. Of more importance to us really is the question of the author's own background, Luke's own background. Is he a Gentile or a Jew? He does give evidence of having a Hellenistic literary education. In his use of gospel material, he does sometimes avoid Semitic concepts. He also seems to have little interest in Jewish cultic matters. It does appear that his readership would largely be Gentile. On the other hand, he has an intimate knowledge of the Greek Old Testament, the Septuagint. He has a strong interest in Scripture, in law, and in the prophets. He presents the supreme importance of Jerusalem, especially in the Acts of the Apostles. In Acts we see portrayals of synagogue worship, although even in the Gospel we see Jesus himself reading from Isaiah at a synagogue worship. And then we have a very Jewish milieu, especially found in the infancy narratives of Luke. Ultimately, the question is unanswerable, but Father Joseph Fitzmyer offers an interesting hypothesis. He suggests that Luke converted first to Judaism, so he's born a Gentile, becomes Jewish. That would explain his knowledge of both the Jewish and the Gentile context, and that he later, as a previous convert to Judaism, then converts to Christianity. Again, while not provable, it's certainly an interesting theory. Luke is cited by 150 AD, and he uses Mark, therefore he must be post 70 AD. So that gives us the range of our possibilities for dating. Early Christian concerns, such as the legitimacy of the Gentile mission, seem to have faded in Luke, pushing us back a little bit from 70 AD. But we also know that Paul's letters have circulated fairly widely by 90 AD. So most would place Luke's gospel as having been composed somewhere between 80 and 90 AD. His audience appears to be predominantly Gentile. So he seems to, in both Luke 1 and in Acts, volume 2, emphasize freedom from the law. There's a sense in which Israel has already been displaced in the Acts by this new Christian community, the Way or the Church. He uses a Greco-Roman literary style. Now, this is not necessarily definitive. There certainly would have been many Jews of the time who would be familiar with the style of Greco-Roman literary style, but nevertheless it adds with these other factors to suggest that the audience here is Gentile. There are also mistakes in Palestinian geography, and Luke replaces Semitic expressions. So Abba, which is spoken of in Mark, which would be the term father in Aramaic, is translated into the Greek as ha pater. The audience for this gospel also appears to be a third-generation Christian audience. The eschatology of the gospel is not as immediate as that of Mark. It seems to expect that Jesus will return, but that return will not be immediate, that in the meanwhile one must live a Christian life. Therefore, Jesus must give advice and teaching for Christian discipleship and for the life of the community. We also see in the gospel indications of economic and cultural diversity among the members of the community, again suggesting some period of time that has now passed since the death and resurrection of Jesus. Luke also does seem to be concerned with the question of church and state, and we'll return to this, but remember that his gospel is addressed to Most Excellent Theophilus. So he's given a title suggesting that this may be an official of some kind in the Roman Empire. On the other hand, Theophilus means lover of God, and it may be a simple representational name. As far as the location for Luke's community, the theories range pretty much between Rome and Jerusalem and everything in between, but perhaps the strongest arguments can be made for Ephesus, which would be in western Anatolia or modern-day Turkey, and then Antioch, which would be the far corner of Turkey on the border of Syria, both of which are relatively large cities in this period and appear to have had large Christian communities.